I didn't quite know what to expect when I started playing Final Fantasy XIV, A Realm Reborn. By the time the beta version of the game had released on the PlayStation 3 in 2013, I had played through the vast majority of mainline entries in the Final Fantasy series, many of which I was incredibly fond of, but my experience with MMORPGs was extremely lacking. I had only previously played the first MMO in the series, Final Fantasy XI, for a few hours at most, and I spent those hours wandering around with no clue as to what I was supposed to be doing. When I finally started up 14, I was happy to see that the overall experience was much more welcoming to newcomers. And while I was fascinated by the beauty of the world of Hydaelyn, I ultimately grew tired of running around that world, completing monotonous tasks for every civilian who was too lazy to get their own groceries. That, combined with the main story's rather slow start, and a battle system that felt entirely unfamiliar to a fan of single-player RPGs like myself, caused me to drop the game without giving it much of a second thought. Needless to say, things did not stay that way. After the game had been fully released and had received a number of main story updates through expansions and patches, I was eventually inspired to pick it back up, and was filled with determination to catch up to the content in the game's expansions that appeared to promise much more than what I had experienced with my initial test run. What I found this time was an experience that was nothing short of beautiful. Thus am I here to talk about the elements of world building, character writing, and storytelling in Final Fantasy XIV that grabbed a hold of my heart and would not let go. This is my letter in a bottle, written to any who may find it upon their shores, about my love for Final Fantasy XIV. The story of Final Fantasy XIV is set in the world of Hydaelyn. When you're first introduced to the world, you learn primarily about Eorzea, a realm comprised of the western continent of Aldenard and its surrounding islands, as well as the handful of city-states that make up Eorzea's civilizations. There's Gridania, a city shrouded in vast, lush forests, whose people capitalize on the resources at hand to make livings as carpenters or leather workers. Then you have Ul'dah, the bustling megacity of artisans and merchants that stands as a grand oasis in the middle of a harsh desert. You've got Limsa Lominsa, located on an island just off the western shore of the continent, a trade center that thrives on buying and selling imported goods with other nations. Early on in the game's main story, you get to watch as these three city-states put aside their differences and form an alliance to deal with large-scale problems, such as the inevitable attempts by the fierce Garlean Empire of the northeastern continent of Ilsabard to invade and conquer the lands of Eorzea. We also learn about a fourth city-state to the far north called the Holy See of Ishgard, whose people are far too engrossed in their ongoing war with an ancient race of dragons to bother with foreign relations. As you travel to each of these city-states through the main storyline, you become acquainted with their leaders and gain the opportunity to learn how each city functions on a larger scale and how they differ from each other. For instance, Gridania is run by the Elder Seedseer, a woman of great importance to the religious beliefs of the city-state, who can hear the voices of the spirits of the wood. While Ul'dah, in stark contrast, is run by a council of 6 of the wealthiest businessmen and women residing in the city, who work together to ensure an ever-thriving economy. Limsa Lominsa was founded by several crews of pirates, who realized that they could increase their collective wealth by putting their sea-traveling skills to use, and, as such, is run by the former captain of one of those founding pirate crews. While the main storyline provides you with information on the world from a large-scale political perspective, the abundance of side quests in each location explores the world from a much more up-close and personal perspective, and focuses more heavily on the daily lives of the civilians. To give you an idea, we learn through the side quests that many of the people residing in and around Ishgard live in poverty due to the heavy toll taken on the city by its ongoing war with the dragons, and must struggle to find food to eat, shelter to warm them from the cold, and weapons to protect themselves and their families from dragon attacks. A number of the civilians of Ul'dah are, in fact, refugees that fled from their homeland of Alamigo, a once great city-state located east of Gridania that was conquered by the Garlean Empire in recent years. When you combine these two different forms of storytelling that Final Fantasy XIV utilizes, You end up gaining a comprehensive understanding of a world that feels so alive and functioning that you can easily imagine yourself actually living there. Two other major factions that are integral to the world of Hydaelyn are the Scions of the Seventh Dawn, a small group of men and women who are unaffiliated with any particular city-state and who are wholly devoted to the protection and preservation of Eorzea, and the Ascians, an enigmatic cult shrouded in shadow whose name gradually turns up more frequently as you learn more about a number of seemingly natural disasters. You progress through the story of Final Fantasy XIV from the perspective of a member of the Scions of the Seventh Dawn, and so the 10 or so prominent members of the group are what you would consider your main party, and are the characters you'll be interacting the most with for the majority of the main storyline. Of course, it wouldn't make sense for all of these members to join you on every mission you embark on, so you often get paired up with 2 or 3 of them at a time, allowing you to get to know the strengths, weaknesses, and personalities of the Scions little bits at a time. As for the Scions who aren't joining you on your missions, you never get the sense that they're simply sitting around headquarters waiting for things to happen. Instead, there's a clear sense that each member is off doing their own thing, putting their individual talents to the best possible use, spending time in places that they're more familiar with or can be more productive in, etc. Urianger, the resident scholar of the Scions, can often be found in libraries reading up on any pressing subjects, until such a chance arises for him to put his knowledge to use out in the field. On the other hand, Ida and Papalymo, a skilled melee fighter and mage respectively, spend most of their time surveying some of the more dangerous lands so as to keep an eye out for any looming threats that the Scions may need to deal with. In opposition to the Scions are the Ascians, also known as the Bringers of Chaos. The Ascians can be considered the primary antagonists of the main storyline, but they are far from the kind of villains who spend their time kidnapping princesses and trying to interfere with your heroic deeds. On the contrary, the Ascians are often portrayed as being quite peaceful, confronting the Scions on multiple occasions simply to talk without bearing any animosity. The villainous acts of the Ascians are often so subtle and hidden behind the scenes that most of the threats you face won't appear to be related to the Ascians at all, until you realize later on that their actions were the spark that lit the flames of conflict. In this way, the Ascians too feel like people living their own lives with their own agendas who may from time to time cross paths with you. Now, I'd like to take some time to talk about you, or rather, your player character through which you'll experience the story. When you first journey to Eorzea and join the guild associated with your preferred style of fighting, you are merely labeled as an adventurer. If you haven't heard of this fantasy trope before, being an adventurer means that you're a selfless jack-of-all-trades who couldn't possibly turn down a plea for help. The adventurer is a perfectly blank slate for you to project yourself onto so that you can watch the story unfold through the characters and settings around you, rather than through your own character growth or backstory. Eventually, as you progress through the main story and complete more significant tasks, you drop the title of adventurer for the far more favorable title of Warrior of Light. Through your journeys with the Scions of the Seventh Dawn, you, as the Warrior of Light, encounter a number of godlike beasts known as primals that you must slay in order to keep them from wreaking havoc on otherwise peaceful lands. Slaying a primal is something that only a select few in Eorzea have managed to accomplish even once in their lives. So, naturally, the other Scions, the military leaders, and any civilians who are aware of the work you're doing can hardly contain their immense gratitude and awe towards you. This brings us to what I'll say is the early portrayal of the Warrior of Light, one of the few elements of Final Fantasy XIV that had initially put me off a bit. At this point in the game, Final Fantasy XIV wants to remind you repeatedly that you, the player, are a great and wonderful person, that you are a strong, talented, selfless, loving, and an all-around incredible person. These frequent reminders come off as unnecessary, corny, and like fluffy filler text that I would often skim through to get to the real dialogue that was pertinent to the main story. There's simply nothing difficult about making the choice to be a good person in a video game after all. Now, as much as I was put off by this, Over time, I began to notice a change in the characters' tones as they would speak about the player. This later portrayal takes an annoying little quirk and turns it into a fascinating observation regarding the Warrior of Light as a character. During this later portion, when characters speak highly of the things you've done, it no longer feels like they are speaking directly to you to tell you how great you are. Instead, it feels like they're recognizing the Warrior of Light as something greater than themselves. Let me show you what I mean by this. In a world where only the strongest and hardened soldiers have lived to tell the tale of a fight against a single primal, the Warrior of Light, someone who simply appeared in Eorzea one day with no history or reason for being there, has slain more than a dozen primals with ease, and has consistently fought on the winning side of every war and revolution he or she has taken part in. If I was to imagine myself in the position of one of the locals of Eorzea, witnessing the might of this warrior, I might think something like this. This Warrior of Light is clearly some kind of superhuman. It's like he's either a blessing from the gods or a god himself who has graced us with his presence. To have him on my side means to all but ensure our victory, as though he is the very key to victory personified. Now, while none of the characters say those words exactly, it is precisely that kind of reverence that you begin to sense from the scions and the military leaders you interact with. They don't bother to shower you with praise quite in the way that they used to. They already know just how capable you are. Instead, they're simply grateful that you happen to be in the right place at the right time to assist them in such dire circumstances. People talk about force of nature villains in media. Think of Heath Ledger's The Joker, Dio, or any iteration of Ganondorf. Those evildoers who exist to embody some negative trait like chaos or hatred, and who have no need for backstory, motive, or character development. In Final Fantasy XIV, you, as the Warrior of Light, are a force of nature hero, embodying righteous power and selflessness. This is the later portrayal of the Warrior of Light, and it is an element of the story that's truly grown on me. I've briefly mentioned the existence of primals in the land of Eorzea. The primals are Final Fantasy XIV's iteration of the ever-recurring summoned monsters of the Final Fantasy series, like Ifrit, Shiva, or Bahamut, but have yet to touch on a crucial part of their presence in the story. That is, how they each come into being. The story goes that many of these primals were once deities that each ruled and protected a certain group of intelligent creatures known as beast tribes. The peaceful and playful sylphs of the forest were ruled by the wise Ramu. The easily angered kobolds who lived in the mountains and caves were ruled by the wrathful Titan. The Sahagin of the sea were ruled by the great serpent Leviathan, and so on. Each of these deities has long since vanished from the realm, and it's unclear whether they've went into hiding, perished, or disappeared by any other means. The beast tribes, then, have the ability to perform a ritual which will summon their respective deity back to the realm in order to help them in their time of greatest need. This whole concept seems simple enough at first, but as you see more and more primals summoned back to Eorzea, some begin to have some unusual circumstances surrounding them. The first example of these unusual circumstances that really caught my attention was that of Good King Mogglmog XII, the primal summoned by the Moogles. Among the beast tribe of Moogles, there is a legend that states the ancestors of Moogles once lived up in the clouds, but that they were eventually forced to relocate due to a war that took place in the sky. In response to this war, the king of these cloud-dwelling Moogles, known as Good King Mogglmog XII, fashioned an immensely long rope for his subjects to use to climb down to the surface while he stayed behind and held the rope in place. He did this until he was the only one left with no means of descending to the surface himself. The Moogles now tell his story in order to honor the sacrifice that he made for his people. But did he really? We learn shortly thereafter that the story of King Mogglmog is, in actuality, a myth. That although the Moogles tell this story to their children, there is no evidence to support the idea that the king or his rope ever actually existed. Despite this knowledge, We then witness the Mughal beast tribe actually succeed in summoning their king into reality as a fully fledged primal. About 1,000 years prior to the events of Final Fantasy XIV's main story, in the northern city-state of Ishgard, there lived a woman called Saint Shiva. Shiva believed wholeheartedly that there could be peace between the human races and the race of dragons, and so she lived out her life striving to make that peace a reality. In her efforts to speak with the dragons, she gradually became close to an ancient dragon by the name of Raisfelger. Shiva and Raisfelger eventually fell in love, and through their love they did, in fact, manage to bring about a time of peace. However, as human lifespans are as mere moments in the eyes of the dragons, who can live to be thousands of years old, Shiva requested that she be wholly devoured by her dragon lover, so that her soul may reside with him for the rest of his long life. Now, in current-day Ishgard, we find a woman named Isael, who wants to reunite that age-old peace between humans and dragons. To accomplish this, Isael performs a summoning to bring Saint Shiva back to life, and to have her speak with the still-living Raisfelger. However, this doesn't go as planned. Upon seeing the summoned Shiva, Raisfelger confirms that she is not the woman he once knew and loved. Rather, the summoned Shiva is merely an imitation, a physical manifestation of Isael's perception of who Shiva once was. Half of this perception was based on information written down in history books, and the other half came from Isael's own imagination. That mental image is what was summoned and brought to life, not the woman who had once lived and walked the earth. So, what do both of these unusual summonings tell us about the primals of Eorzea? They tell us that the primal summoning ritual, which requires a great amount of crystal energy and faith in the one being summoned, does not truly call back a previously living being. Instead, it seems to show that anyone who has faith in a powerful being, be they historical or fictional, has the power to make the very concept of that powerful being into a reality. I found this to be a fascinating fresh take on the concept of summoning powerful creatures to fight for you that has been a main staple of the franchise for decades. With few exceptions, nearly every game in the Final Fantasy franchise has maintained a T for teen rating here in the West. Final Fantasy XIV is not one of those exceptions, which is why I was taken by surprise when I began to realize just how dark and mature some aspects of this game's story could be. Unlike many of the fantasy worlds that I've seen portrayed in JRPGs, Hydaelyn is a world that acknowledges the darker sides of human nature, and does not shy away from showing the kinds of atrocities people can commit when they're driven by immense greed, lust, or sheer cruelty. One instance that made this very clear to me is the story of a woman named Yotsuyu. When you first encounter Yotsuyu, she's working under the Garlean Empire and using her power to oppress and control the weakened people of Doma. We see how ready she is to take the lives of those who disobey her rule, and how sadistically she toys with the people beneath her, going so far as to hand a young man a gun and to order him to shoot his own parents. We also see that she takes great pleasure in torturing, both physically and psychologically, those she's taken captive, and even her own subordinates. Of course, it simply would not be enough for this story to introduce an awful character who does awful things. In a world like Hydaelyn, no villain is purely evil just for the sake of being evil. Behind every despicable character is a cause for their behavior. Through the story, we come to learn of Yotsuyu's tragic upbringing. Her parents had died while she was still a young child, and so she was taken in by her domin and an uncle, who already had a son of their own. This couple showered their son with attention and adoration, utterly spoiling him and providing him with the best education that they could afford. Their adopted daughter, however, did not mean nearly as much in their eyes. She was instead treated as more of a slave than a child, and was forced to do unhealthy amounts of manual labor throughout her childhood and teenage years. Yotsuyu was denied any level of proper education, and she certainly did not receive the kind of love or affection that a young girl ought to have. When she finally came of age, Yotsuyu was then sold off to marry a rich man in order to make her adoptive family more wealthy. Sadly, her new husband turned out to be a vicious old drunkard who would beat her as he pleased. When Yotsuyu would cry out to the family that sold her to this man, they simply told her to grin and bear it, and ultimately turned a blind eye to her suffering. Eventually, the drunk old man passed away, but he died with a massive debt to his name, and so Yotsuyu was sold into prostitution to pay it off. The owner of the brothel later describes what he saw in her. He says that behind her eyes was an emptiness, like she had given up on life, like she was more of a doll than a woman. Despite this, he found that she was extremely popular with customers, and so, even though it felt wrong to him, he kept her around simply because of the profit that she helped bring in. It was through Yotsuyu's popularity in this line of work that she became increasingly able to pry information from the mouths of the men who paid for her services. And once she had become so skilled at gathering information, she was hired by the Garlean Empire to work as a spy, ultimately being given the high rank that we see her with, where she rules over the Doman people who had tormented her from the very beginning. Yotsuyu's story is one that goes to great lengths to paint her both as a terrible person who commits disgusting acts against innocents, and also as a poor girl who has been abused and violated for as long as she's been alive. She isn't a good person, and although her actions cannot be condoned, you're given such a believable explanation for how she became the person she is, that you end up feeling sympathetic towards her despite everything she's done. Now, here's the thing. Each of the points I've covered thus far are observations that I had made prior to July of 2019. That is to say, prior to the release of Final Fantasy XIV's latest expansion, Shadowbringers. Let me just say that Shadowbringers did something truly incredible when it took every single element that I had come to love about this game in A Realm Reborn, Heavensward, and Stormblood, and turned them all up to 11. Where the first two expansions took the player to new cities or continents, Shadowbringers takes you to an alternate parallel world called Norvrant that originated from the same starting point as Hydaelyn. This means that the civilizations in this new world have different ways of going about their lives, different beliefs, different hardships to endure, and hopes and dreams to aspire to than anything we've seen up until this point. Even small details, like the names that they use to refer to the different races of people that exist between both worlds, have changed up to make the world feel more interesting and believable. To give you an idea, in Hydaelyn I play an Elezen, but I'm known by the locals of Norvrant as an elf. The tiny Lalafels of Eorzea are known as dwarves in Norvrant. The Hrothgar are known as Ronso, the Mikote are known as Mistel, and so on. Where many Final Fantasies play with the idea of the warriors of light rising up to overcome the darkness, Norvrant is a world ruined at the hands of overwhelming, oppressive light. And so it is in need of warriors of darkness to bring balance once more. The number of contrasts, both small and large, between these two worlds are all so delicately crafted that after learning so much about Hydaelyn, your desire to learn about this new world is fully renewed, as though you had just started your adventure from the very beginning. Shadowbringers then tops all of this off with one of the best displays of storytelling in Final Fantasy's 30-plus years of raising the bar for stories in gaming. It demonstrates so many fascinating ways that the residents of Norvrant deal with the oppressive light that threatens to end their world. Some struggle to fight against it. Some give up hope that anyone could ever face it. Some run away to indulge in escapist fantasies, and others pray to their gods to be saved by faith. The story also introduces one of the most believable and sympathetic villains in the series' history, who truly stands out as one of the high points of the game. So much so that you may find yourself questioning whether you're really fighting on the right side by the time you reach the final battle. This latest expansion absolutely has enough going for it to warrant all of the praise it's gotten since its release last summer, and I may return to talk about it at greater length in a future video. I didn't quite know what to expect when I started playing Final Fantasy XIV, A Realm Reborn. I couldn't bring myself to believe that an MMORPG could ever achieve the same heights in world building, character writing, and storytelling that the Final Fantasy franchise was once known for. But what I found was a game that went above and beyond all of my expectations, and ultimately cemented itself in my heart as one of the most fascinating worlds I've had the pleasure of diving headfirst into. If this message in a bottle has landed upon your shores, I strongly encourage you to dive into the world of Heidelin for yourself to see what I mean. Sincerely, Abel's Lance.